teachers in first grade are instructed to tell people, just because you have what some people might call boy parts, notice what some people might call, not even acknowledging that maybe it really is. Just because you have what some people might call boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy, doesn't mean, and just because you have what some people call girl parts does not mean you're a girl. You know, what really matters is your feelings. So from Descartes, which you brought, we started with, to Judith Butler, to today's kindergarten class.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. I hope you had a nice 4th of July. Mine was very relaxing. But today I have a very special guest. But before I get to that, remember that we are on Patreon and you can subscribe as little as $5 a month and to support the show, and it helps out a lot. So there's a link below. But today I have a guest, Professor Nancy Pearcey. She's written many books. She's the author of Love Thy Body, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality. This is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. I just finished reading it a few days ago. She's also the author of Saving Leonardo. You may have heard of this book. It came out in 2010. And it's a great book as well. It's the subtitle is A Call to Resist the Secular Assault on Mind, Morals, and Meaning. She's also written several other books, including The Soul of Science, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. She has been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek magazine, highlighted as one of the top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Welcome, Nancy Pearcey.
Thank you so much, Becket. It's good to be here.
So glad to have you on the show. Love Thy Body. I just read this, I guess, last week or a couple weeks ago, and so amazing. I highly recommend it. And again, the subtitle is Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality. And so I want to get into this book. I have a lot of highlighting in the book. We won't go through all of it, but I just want to ask some of the points that stuck out to me. So first of all, you start in chapter 1, you set up the whole book with this kind of 2-story division metaphor. Can you explain this dualism? Explain what that you mean by this.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a good place to start. I became a Christian at L'Abri through the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And one of Francis Schaeffer's main themes in his apologetics was that the concept of truth has been divided, and that this is the main barrier that Christians face in talking to secular people today, or even talking to their own kids, right? Is that the concept of truth has been divided. And so when you say to somebody, Christianity is true, they no longer know what you mean. And right. Here's how he expressed it. Later, I discovered that there is a way that the secular world talks about this division of truth. It's called the fact-value split, fact/value split. And so that might be an easy way to label it. Schaeffer didn't use that label, but I did in my book. My book, Total Truth, is where I kind of dealt with this concept of the divided concept of truth. And what it means is this. Most civilizations have thought that there is a natural order and there's a moral spiritual order, but that the two are united, that there's a single cosmos, and therefore there's a single truth that explains all of reality. And we had that here in the West until the rise of the scientific revolution. With the rise of modern science, many people began to say, no, the only reliable form of truth is what we know by science, empirically verifiable facts. And what do you do then with things that cannot be directly verified by science, like moral and spiritual truths? Well, they're not considered truths anymore. They've been put into a separate category called values, which means your personal preference, your personal experience, what gives you a sense of meaning, but is considered relativistic and subjective. And so the philosophers often use the metaphor of two stories in a building. Where the lowest story is objective facts knowable by science, and the upper story is where we toss anything that cannot be tested put in a test tube or studied under a microscope. So morality, spirituality, purpose, meaning, beauty, all of these things that are more intangible are put up in the upper story where they're considered not really truths anymore. And so that is what secular people call the fact value split. And Schaeffer said, when we tell people Christianity is true, what happens is that they don't know it, but they have the fact value split, in their mind. And so they unreflectively, unthinkingly, they just throw Christianity in the upper story where they think we're not talking about objective truth. They think we're talking about what gives me personal meaning, what makes me feel good, what gets me through the night. And they're likely to say, well, I'm happy for you.
Yeah.
I'm glad that works for you. But they don't even hear you making an objective truth claim. And so Schaeffer used to say that was the main barrier to communicating, not, like I said, not just with the secular world, but our own kids are being trained in the fact value split. And so because that was a big part of my becoming a Christian, is understanding the split view of truth, when I started looking around at other subjects, I discovered, well, wow, if your view of truth is split, it affects everything else. And so when I picked up the moral issues in my book, Love Thy Body, like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, and so on, I discovered there too that there was a split understanding, in this case, of the human being, because the moral issues affect how we see the human being, and there was a split there as well. And so that was kind of what got me started writing Love Thy Body, is I wanted to try to explain how that split affects all of our thinking about the moral issues.
Yeah, and explain that split in terms of abortion. For example, you talk about Roe v. Wade. I mean, Roe v. Wade, there's this concept of human versus person. So talk about personhood and how the idea of personhood has a low view of the human body.
Yes, it's actually an abortion where the split view was first applied. I think the first person was the secular bioethicist Peter Singer. Secular bioethicists began to talk about the body versus the person. And I quickly realized it was the same split, because the body is what we know by science. Genetic people like Peter Singer, bioethicists, were saying, okay, the fetus is human from conception.
Right.
The evidence from genetics and DNA is just too strong to deny it. The fetus is biologically, physiologically, anatomically, chromosomally human.
Right.
Just read any embryology textbook. So how did they get around that then? Because they did still want to support abortion. So secular bioethicists said, well, the fetus may be human, but it's not a person until sometime later, when it usually defined in terms of certain mental abilities, certain level of cognitive functioning, self-awareness, and so on. Well, if you can be human at one point, but not a person until sometime later, then clearly these are two different things. And so I recognized that, and actually it was Catholic thinkers who first recognized this. People like John Paul II were the first to recognize that secular bioethicists had shifted their argument. They no longer said the fetus is not human. They said, oh, sure, the fetus is human, but it's not a person. And that was that two-story, like I said, the metaphor of two stories in a building. That was that two-story dichotomy applied to the human person. The body is what we know by science, that's facts. But in the value sphere, how do we value human life? What moral status do we give it? Does it warrant legal protection? That was all upper story. And so in a sense, it becomes completely arbitrary and subjective, because if personhood is not connected to being biologically human, then what is it based on? It turns out it is completely subjective. Every bioethicist draws the line at a different place. There was no agreement among secular bioethicists when personhood starts. And so this was something that Christians needed to get on board with, because they were still arguing. And I still hear this from readers or if I speak, at a conference and stuff, I still have people coming up to me and say, "Oh, I realize I'm still arguing, in a way that secular people are no longer, I'm answering questions they're no longer answering. I'm still arguing that the fetus is human, whereas the cutting edge today is, okay, it's human, but it's not a person." And Roe v. Wade actually did instantiate that in law. And Roe v. Wade Justice Blackmun did argue that the fetus is human, but not a person. So when we overturn Roe v. Wade, we now have the opportunity to revisit that argument, and Christians need to make sure they are reading the secular bioethicists and they're up on the latest version of their argument.
Yeah, and of course, this split between the body and personhood, or human and being a human, being a person, has massive implications on everything, including assisted suicide, transgenderism, homosexuality, but which we're going to get into. So there's this, it permeates everything, this secular idea.
Yeah, that was one of the exciting things about my book, Love Thy Body, is, we tend to try to master arguments for each of these issues separately. In fact, Schaeffer used to say that. He said, we try to deal with these issues in bits and pieces, was his way of putting it. And what we need to understand is there's a common underlying worldview under all of these issues. And if you master that worldview, it will be so much easier for you to argue against the secular worldview. There's a common underlying worldview. And that's what I tried to get across in Love Thy Body. I tried to train Christians and others on what is the underlying worldview that underlies all of these moral issues.
Yeah, and you talk about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, and how that really, that had a huge impact on how we view the body, how we view, and how his logic undergirds abortion. So talk about a little bit about Darwin and how pernicious his ideas are, and have, influenced the world, really, and especially the West.
Yeah, actually, I usually talk about that, and especially in the context of homosexuality, because I have a wonderful quote from Camille Paglia, who I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Camille Paglia has a wonderful quote.
Who is a feminist. She's not a believer. She's a feminist. Yes.
Oh, and she's a feminist. She's a lesbian. She's a well-known public intellectual. But she's recently come out as trans. Did you realize that?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I double checked.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
She's now saying she's trans.
Wow.
But the interesting thing about her, and the reason that a lot of Christians read her stuff, is she is a bit of an iconoclastic feminist. In other words, she denies that sex is just a social construction. She says, no, nature made us male and female. And actually, I recently found a quote from her where she said, let's see if I can remember her exact words. She says, humans are designed for sexual reproduction. She uses the word designed. But then you say to her, well, in that case, how do you justify being lesbian or now trans, if nature made us male and female? And her answer is this. She says this in an essay. She says, why not defy nature? After all, again, a direct quote, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So the logic there is, if the bodies are products of blind material forces, as Darwin said, then they convey no moral message. They give us no clue to our identity. We are not morally obligated they have no intrinsic purpose.
Right.
That we're morally obligated.
There's no telos. Right.
Exactly. No telos, no teleology. And therefore, we may do with them as we see fit. And that is perfectly logical. I love the fact that she really unpacks the logic of the Darwinian view. And our response, therefore, has to also go back to nature. Ethics are always derived from nature because the human body is part of nature. And so as Christians, we need to go back all the way to
Aristotle. Or Genesis, but before that, to Genesis 1 and 2, but Aristotle as well.
Teleological as well. Yeah. But yeah, Genesis, well, or the science itself. Today, it's pretty obvious from science itself that, as Aristotle said, eyes are made for seeing, ears are made for hearing, wings are made for flying, fins are made for swimming. And today we know even better, but there's a geneticist who jokingly says we should give Aristotle a Nobel Prize because he basically discovered genetics. He discovered that there's an inbuilt plan or blueprint that governs the development of the entire organism. So science itself shows that nature has a plan, an order, a blueprint, a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And what Christians are saying is that when we live in harmony with that purpose, we will be happier and healthier.
And then in chapter 2 of Love Thy Body, you get into Descartes, René Descartes, the 17th century French philosopher. And you talk about Descartes and his influence on our thinking in the West, and his influence regarding dualism, his idea of the ghost in the machine, that we're just machines. But talk about that. And also, if people don't know who Descartes is, he's famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." And I like how you break that down in your book. Just cogito, or is it cogito or cogito? I never know what it is. Ergo sum. What the implications of "I think, therefore I am" are.
Yeah. I have sometimes been asked to do lectures just on transgenderism alone. And so, which is only one chapter of the book. But so what I do is I show how the divided concept of the person developed over time. And from Plato, who said the body is the prison of the soul.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned a moment ago that all of these issues depend on a low view of the body. Well, that's a low view of the body. Plato said, and Gnosticism too, which the early church fathers were up against. They said that the material realm is a realm of death, decay, and destruction, and therefore it's bad. And the goal of salvation is to escape from the body. But the modern form of dualism really starts with Descartes. So Descartes was a French philosopher who explicitly said, the body is part of nature, and therefore it's part of the Newtonian world machine. It's completely mechanistic. And then the soul is some mysteriously connected to this machine. But it's the soul that actually determines who we are, right? As you said, cogito ergo sum means I think, therefore I am. Therefore, our entire identity is tied up with our thinking, with our mind. And Kant is really the next one. Kant goes even further. Kant says, Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, and by that time, the Descartes' dualism was pretty well established. But he took it a step farther, and he said, well, the order that we think we find in nature is not really there. It's just a product of the human mind. And so even the order in nature is just a social construction, and which was what postmodernism, I mean, he was really the founder of postmodernism.
Right.
Postmodernism today says, even science is just a human construction. It's not objective truth. And so that leads us, therefore, to Judith Butler, who is considered the founder of queer theory.
Right.
And she essentially says, we think gender is a social construction, but no, even sex is a social construction. Because yes, when pressed, by the way, it was fun. It was kind of fun to watch this dialogue going on, because feminists protested against Judith Butler. And they said, well, if sex is just a social construction, what do we do about women's rights? If we can't say that we're biologically female, what happens to rights that are based on the fact that we are biologically female? And so pressed on the issue, Judith Butler finally said, yeah, there is material reality. But the minute we start talking about material reality, we're using language, and language is a social construction. So we really do have no access to the material reality. And you might enjoy this, Becket. I actually read an article, a whole book by one of Judith Butler's students. Her name is Gail Solomon. She teaches at Princeton University. And what the intellectuals say is what filters down to the popular level.
Yep.
So of course I had to, her book was a defense of transgenderism. So of course I read it. And here's what she said: your gender has nothing to do with your physical anatomy. And let me see if I can give you the exact quote. The material, here's how she put it: the real body, real in quotes, meaning the physical body, the real body tells us nothing. it has no meaning at all. That was the exact words. The physical body has no meaning at all. So this is what is being taught all the way down to kindergartners today. You know, what Judith Butler taught radical students a couple decades ago is now being taught to kindergartners, that your body is totally meaningless. I read a curriculum not long ago that instructs teachers in a first grade lesson. This is a first grade lesson. And it was in the Washington Post. So of course, you know, this is widespread. Teachers in first grade are instructed to tell people, just because you have what some people might call boy parts, notice what some people might call, not even acknowledging that maybe it really is. Just because you have what some people might call boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy, doesn't mean, and just because you have what some people call girl parts does not mean you're a girl. You know, what really matters is your feelings. So from Descartes, you know, which you brought, you know, we started with, to Judith Butler, to today's kindergarten class, first graders. There was an article in the newspaper not long ago where parents were taking the school to court because a child, I think this was a first grader, the child had come home saying, you know, my teacher's saying just because you have girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl, just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a girl. Boy, what am I getting them confused? Just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy. At any rate, the child had come home saying, Mommy, what am I? Please take me to a doctor so we can find out what I am. And they were taking it was in the news because the family was taking the school district to court for emotional distress. But anyway, that's where we come from. You know, I'm always, you know, I love philosophy. So I'm always telling people, look, you have to understand the intellectual history. You know, what are the experts saying? What are the philosophers saying? If you want to understand what's being taught to your kindergartners and first graders today.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the body is meaningless at this point, you know, in philosophy. It's all about just whatever, you know, whatever you're feeling, filtering all your experience and things through your feelings and how you feel about yourself. There's nothing scientific about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. And that's what's interesting is the reversal, because historically Christians have been thought to be otherworldly, right? That we don't care about this world, we care only about the spiritual realm. One of my students put it this way. She said, growing up in the church, I was always taught spirit good, body bad.
Yeah.
When I speak to Christian audiences, I always get a lot of heads nodding. You know, sounds like what I grew up with. And what's fascinating today is it's turned 180 degrees. Today, it's Christians saying, hey, we're supposed to respect our biology. We're supposed to honor our biology, our bodies. Let me give you a couple of quotes. These are my favorite quotes from the book. Two of the quotes are in the chapter on homosexuality. So you may remember these. So one of them was by, it's the opening anecdote to the chapter on homosexuality. It's Sean Doherty. Sean Doherty.
Yes.
Yeah, so you probably know him, in fact.
I know, I don't know him, but yeah, I remember the quote.
Yeah, you should get in touch with him. Because, you know, he grew up, he's very careful to say he grew up exclusively homosexual, right? Because today he's married and has 3 kids. And what people will often say was, well, you weren't really homosexual then, you were probably bi all along. And so he's very careful to say, no, I was exclusively homosexual, so attracted to other men. And what's interesting about his story is he grew up in a gay affirming family and attended a gay affirming church. So he didn't think there was anything morally wrong with homosexuality. And you ask, well, why did he change then? He said, well, I came to understand, you know, I didn't try to change my feelings directly, which rarely works. He said, but I came to understand that I wanted to respect what I already had. Rather than changing my feelings, I realized what I already had was a male body.
Yeah.
And I wanted to respect it as the way he phrased it, as a good gift from God. And he said, eventually my feelings started to follow suit. And so there, once again, we come back to the question you raised earlier about Darwin. The core of this debate is, do we live in a world created by meaningless, purposeless, mindless forces? Or do we live in a world that's created by a loving creator, which is therefore intrinsically good? And we want to honor our bodies as a good gift from God.
Yeah. I love that quote by him, by the way. It really had a powerful impact on me, because when he said that, yeah, I was created, and I've recently kind of gone through this myself. I think about a month ago, I had this sort of epiphany, and I talked about it on this show recently, but like, I'm a man. God created me male. Like, so, and I'm hoping that that does follow suit. The rest of it follows suit. But yeah, I've finally come to this realization, like, I'm a man. Like, all that stuff I was doing in my past, that was all just distorted. It was such a distortion of sexuality. And that's not who I was, really, because I'm a man and God created me a man. So I love that quote by him. But just quickly back to abortion. You talk about how abortion demeans women. Can you talk about that for a sec?
Yeah, so this was obvious to me even as a non-Christian. I didn't become a Christian until college, and even as a non-Christian, well, I was kind of hippie. So I was kind of into natural things anyway. But the idea of interfering with a natural process, pregnancy is a natural process, and interfering with that natural process with toxic chemicals and lethal, I want to say weapons, equipment, whatever.
Yeah.
Interfering with lethal equipment, killing a baby in the womb. I mean, even as a non-Christian, that struck me as incredibly unnatural.
And violent too, yeah.
And violent. And so, I didn't really, I had a very feminist background. I had, without going into detail, I had a very abusive childhood, and my father was very abusive. And that's the story I'm going to tell in my next book. But it set me up to be a really raving feminist, right? I read all the classic feminist literature and thought each one was better than the one before.
Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir, all of them. Gloria Steinem.
Yes, Kate Millett. Yes.
Yeah, Kate Millett.
Yes, Susan Brown Miller. I mean, I loved them all. I just loved them. But when it came to abortion, I thought, well, wait a minute. That's violating a woman's natural biological processes. In fact, I wasn't even into chemical birth control. You realize that hormonal birth control is considered a carcinogen. It's cancer causing. So even after I got married, we used natural birth control. I didn't want to use chemicals in my body.
Yeah.
So to tell the truth, the idea that you interfere with a woman's natural processes is highly disrespectful to who women are as biological beings. What is it that women have that's distinctive? What is their distinctive contribution? Well, they bear and give new life. And so it turns out historically, you can see this too. Historically, any culture that accepts abortion and infanticide, because infanticide, was accepted all the way back to the ancient Romans and Greeks.
Yeah.
In fact, some of our heroes of the ancient world, like Cicero and Aristotle and Plato, all recommended infanticide as official state policy. If a child is born and it's not completely healthy, they said you have an obligation to kill it or to expose it, put it out into nature to be exposed to the elements and the wild animals. So it was Christianity that changed the West, that said, no, babies are made in God's image and are to be cared for and nurtured and honored, as persons made in God's image. But what many people don't realize is that it also raises the status of women, because if you have a high view of babies, you will have a high view of women who give us babies and who spend a great deal of their lives nurturing, bearing, nurturing, and raising children, especially in pre-modern times. Pre-modern times, which is most of human history, women spent a pretty large majority of their adult life bearing, nursing, and caring for children in a sling on their back, usually all three at once.
Yeah.
So when Jesus rebuked the disciples, remember that when the mothers brought their children to Jesus to be blessed, we understand now why the disciples said, "Get these kids out of here," because that was their culture. Their culture was children. The Romans didn't consider children even full persons. And so you understand where they said, "Go away." Well, when Jesus said, "Bring the children to me," it wasn't just expressing a high view of children, it was expressing respect for mothers, because that is a great part of women's contribution to the human race.
Yeah, I love that. And speaking of feminism, you have a section called The Real War Against Women. And a lot of my old friends in Hollywood, not a lot, several of them have reached out to me, and they are in their 50s now, women, and they were ardent feminists, and they're now single, unmarried, childless, and they have major regrets. And you talk about this in the book, and you talk about the idea that a woman must establish her career before marriage and motherhood, and how this is not really pro-woman.
Yeah, I'll give credit where credit's due. That was partly attribute that to an article by Jennifer Roback Morris. So she's a former feminist, an economist who's writing now, against feminism. But so she writes from the position of somebody who was there, who was putting her career off to have kids, to make it, and she was making it. She was pretty high up in the world of economics. She was being groomed, for national leadership, and she suffered incredible repercussions when she said, "Well, I think I want to step down and have kids." What? What? We've been grooming you for this leadership position, and you're going to give it all up to have children? Well, and then she found out she couldn't have children. She was infertile by that time.
Yeah.
So she's very sensitized to the pressure on young women to get ahead in your career. And of course, I felt this too. With my feminist background, I felt very apologetic about getting married. And I felt even worse when I was pregnant. Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, because you can't hide pregnancy.
Yeah.
You can't hide it. And I felt like, oh man.
It's frowned upon in our culture now to be pregnant. It's just it's like, oh, I don't, yeah.
That's exactly how I felt. I felt I've given up the war.
Yeah.
And it's very obvious. I've given into femininity. And actually, it was while I was pregnant that I finally started reading some books that changed. You know what? I was about halfway through my pregnancy when I said, "This isn't fair to my child. The child that's going to be born here should not be born to such an ambivalent mother. That's not fair to the child." And so I began to read books on that were more, pro women. Books by the La Leche League, which is the organization that helps women breastfeed. They have books, that present motherhood in a very positive way, that present motherhood as a relationship. A lot of people treat parenthood mostly as tasks. Here's a list of tasks that you're going to have to do, changing diapers and feeding and getting up in the middle of the night. It sounds like a lot of work. And I read books that treated it more as a relationship with a little person. And I thought, okay, I can get into that.
Yeah.
That I can get into.
Like
and so I really worked hard at overcoming my feminist bias and trying to become a more positive mother. And I have to tell you though, once childbirth happens, there's a bunch of hormonal changes, as you probably know, and all kinds of hormonal
oxytocin.
You get flooded with these wonderful bonding emotions, bonding hormones that give you bonding emotions. And so I had no problem once my child was born. I just to make sure the records clear on this. I was a very engaged mother. In fact, I homeschooled my kids. I was to have more time with them. I loved being a mother. I say past tense because my youngest son just moved out. But I loved being a mother. I loved homeschooling. I loved being very engaged with my parents. I love being a parent involved with my kids. So, but I had to overcome all of that feminist background in order to do it. And that's why I say feminism is not pro-women. It is not equipping women for what is, for many women, the most life-changing event of their whole life, which is having children.
Yeah. And of course, the New York Times, every single day, there's at least 2 to 3 articles or op-ed pieces denigrating not only motherhood, but denigrating motherhood and denigrating the family. So it's just a constant assault on us in our culture.
But I wanted to let me give you a PS on that. But there's a lot of books, a lot of studies coming out now on how fathers are affected by birth. So I wanted to bring them in too, just so it's not just a motherhood issue. That fathers also have a bonding experience. Do you know that when men become fathers, their oxytocin rises?
Yeah. Well, I found that out in your book. Yes.
Well, actually, I'm not sure if this one is in my, actually, I think it is, because this is the most recent one I read. There's an anthropologist who discovered that men's fathers' oxytocin rises even during pregnancy.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it might not be in there yet. But when a mother and father live together, his oxytocin rises during the pregnancy. And so he's being biochemically equipped. God is biochemically equipping men to be fathers, even during pregnancy. I guess nobody ever even thought to test a man's blood, the chemicals in this blood during his wife's pregnancy. But now they're doing that. And so it is amazing how much fatherhood is also influenced by their biochemistry. So, people who denigrate motherhood have got to open their frame and start realizing fatherhood is just as big a deal for many men. That, like I said, God actually equips men biochemically. Margaret Mead, this is a common in sociology. Margaret Mead said, motherhood is natural for women, but fatherhood is a cultural construction. It turns out that's not true.
Yeah.
Fatherhood is also biochemically grounded. And so that's something that we need to sort of catch up with the science on that.
Yeah, I like that. Well, we're going to skip to, so in Love Thy Body, in chapter 4, it's called Schizoid Sex. And I love that title, but can you just talk just briefly about the dualism and quote unquote hookup culture?
Yeah, you just have to read what young people say. I read articles in places like Rolling Stone magazine, and I have quotes from young people saying things like, to engage in the hookup culture. A young woman named Alicia, who says, you have to turn everything off except your body. You make yourself emotionally invulnerable. What a great summary. She's recognizing that split. I have to have my mind completely separate from my body. And there was another quote, I think was also from Rolling Stone, where a young student said, the mistake people make is they think that there can be 2 dimensions to a relationship, one sexual and one emotional. And this is a direct quote, and they pretend like there are clean lines between them. Mm-hmm. You can just visualize it. Okay, that's that same metaphor of 2 stories, that there's a lower story where we can engage with someone sexually, and it's above the line is the emotional, the connection. Young people are being stuck in this 2-story division in the hookup culture, and it's destroying them. I mean, no wonder it's causing so much heartache and anguish. There was one psychiatrist who said she works at a university campus, and she says the 2 most common medications given out in the campus clinic are birth control pills and antidepressants. And she says that's not an accident.
So in chapter 5 of Love Thy Body, you get into homosexuality, you get into the idea of being born this way, that but how does you talk about this? How does same-sex behavior disparage the body?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And you can tell me what you think of this. So even my homosexual friends agree that on the terms of biology, physiology, anatomy, chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. To embrace a same-sex identity then is to contradict that design. Is to say, why should my body inform my identity? Why should my moral choices be constrained in any way by my biological sex? So in a sense, this is where we get back to Camille Paglia, who said, why should my body have any say in what I do sexually? Because after all, the body is a product of mindless material forces. And we have to help people to see this as a profoundly disrespectful view of the body. One of the other people I quote in the book was a young woman who was a lesbian for several years and became a Christian. And I like her quote. She said, to her own surprise, she began to feel a flickering of heterosexual desire. And today she's married and has 2 kids. But here's how she put it. She said, direct quote, I came to trust. That's how she put it. I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason. And I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design.
Yeah.
And I thought, what a great way of putting it. And when I speak to Christian audiences, I find that this is the hardest thing for them to assimilate, to get their minds around. They're so used to, the common view, this common stereotype of Christians that they're negative, right? Is that this is wrong, it's against the Bible, it's a sin, don't do it, and there's something wrong with you. And that's the message we seem to get from most places. And so I have to reiterate this again and again. No, how do we use positive language? I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. We want to respect our biological sex. We want to live in congruence with who God has made us. We want to live in harmony with our body. These are all positive phrases that I find people have to kind of practice. I spoke at CFDA, which is Christian Medical and Dental Association. A psychiatrist came up to me afterwards and said, so, I have a client who's a woman who thinks she's a man, what do I do? And I said, I use that language, well, honor your body, respect who God made you, live in accord with who God made you to be. Yes, but what do I say? And I said, so I said it again, I reiterated it. Respect your body, honor the biology God. After about 4 times, she finally said, oh, love thy body. It just takes a while to assimilate that positive view that the reason behind the Christian ethic is not negative, but positive, that as Christians, what we want to convey to people is a high view of the body. And in fact, here's how it can sometimes get through to people. What we're facing is what the early Christian church faced, right? The early Christian church faced a Greco-Roman culture that denigrated the body, though for very different reasons, right? The early church faced Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Manichaeism. Do you remember Augustine was a Manichaeist?
Augustine, yeah, he was into that.
But all of these isms treated this world as a realm of death, decay, and destruction, and therefore bad. In fact, Gnosticism taught that there were several levels of gods, and that it was a low-level deity, the lowest god, an evil god.
The demiurge, demiurge. Yeah.
Right. Demiurge just was their way of saying a low-level evil god.
Yeah.
Because this world is evil, therefore it must have been an evil God who created it. So Christianity was completely revolutionary when it came into this culture and said, no, it was not an evil God who created this world. It was the supreme deity who is a good God. And therefore this world is intrinsically good. Though the ultimate scandal was the incarnation, the idea that same good God, the supreme deity, had entered into the material world and taken on a physical body. that was, the incarnation was the ultimate
Yeah.
affirmation of the dignity of the human body.
Yes.
And then, of course, when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, he did escape the the body, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do. But what did he do then?
He returned.
He came back in a physical body.
And he ate fish. Yes.
He ate fish to prove that it was physical. To the ancient Greeks and Romans, this was not spiritual progress. Who would want to come back to the realm of the body? It was utter foolishness to the Greeks, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians. And then at the end of time, what's going to happen? God's not going to scrap the material universe as if he made a mistake the first time around. Let's do something better. No, he's going to renew and restore this material world. He's going to create a new heavens and a new earth.
And we're going to have resurrected bodies.
And we will
be amazing.
Exactly. I was talking to a secular friend about this, and I said, remember, even the Apostles' Creed says resurrection of the body. And she said, oh my goodness, all the way back then. You're right. They realized that Christianity implies a high view of the body because the body itself will be resurrected. Yeah. So what I hope to help people to realize is that this is an incredibly high view of the material world. There's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy, and we should be absolutely excited about communicating it to people.
I wanted to ask you about gay marriage, because there's this whole concept of, what is it? There's no harm. It's innocuous. It doesn't really harm anyone that gays can get married, but actually it harms marriage. There's so much harm done there, which it leads to the breakdown of the family, which leads to mental illness, depression, suicide, homelessness, like all of the above, because people don't understand that. They don't understand that gay marriage is not just some sort of innocuous thing.
Yeah, it would have been nice to get to that, and maybe we can have another time.
Yeah.
What I've done, in my lectures, I've had a chance. I mean, the book's been out 3 years, so my lectures are now, even clearer than the book. I wish I could go back and rewrite the book. But what I do in my lectures, I really pull out and simplify the political implications. And let's see if I can do it without my notes. In each one of these cases, the state itself is putting itself on the side of the denigration of the body. So abortion, the state itself is essentially saying, you're not a person, your body means nothing. We will only give you legal protection when you are a person defined in terms of mental abilities. So it's basically denigrate. That's illegal. Legally, it is said being a human is no longer enough for human rights. If it acknowledges that you're human, but says you still have no rights, that you could still be killed for any reason or no reason, you can be, experimented on, you can be picked through for sellable body parts, like Planned Parenthood has done, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. And that's how the medical journals talk about it, medical waste. The body is human, but now it's just medical waste. So the state has itself put itself on the side of saying, the body, being human, physically, materially, genetically human, does not give you any rights. Marriage, back up. Here's how I put it. A free society is only possible if you have some rights that are pre-political, right? That the state doesn't create them.
Right.
Because if the state creates them, it can take them away. So the right to life used to be thought as a pre-political right. It's something you had just because you were a member of the human race. You didn't have that just because the state gave it to you. Well, Declaration of Independence, you're endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. But now, essentially, what Roe v. Wade did was say, no, you don't have rights for being human, but only if the state decides you're a person. So it greatly expanded the power of the state. Marriage is a pre-political right. Humans naturally come together and form families. The state doesn't create marriage. It can regulate it to some degree, like saying you have to be a certain age or whatever. But the state doesn't create marriage. But what the Supreme Court did in Obergefell was to say, well, biology doesn't matter. What matters is an emotional connection to this other person. So again, see, that's upper story. It's like the biological connection between males and females is not going to have any legal recognition. We will only recognize this particular kind of emotional connection. But the trouble is, of course, we have lots of emotional connections. So who decides which ones qualify as marriage? Well, the state. So again, it was a huge power grab by the state.
Yeah.
Parenthood, by the way, do you realize, parenthood, of course, used to be thought to be a pre-political right. It's based on biology. The woman who gives birth is the mother, and the state recognized her legal husband as the biological parent. This is called the presumption of parenthood. But same-sex couples, they could adopt, but they didn't want to do that because number one, it's long and expensive. But number two, they said they wanted to be treated exactly like opposite sex couples. Anything less than that was discrimination. And the Supreme Court agreed in 2017. There's a Supreme Court decision, Pavan, I think it's called, that said, as long as you're legally married, even if you're not genetically related to the child, you are the legal parent. And so now, essentially, you are the child's legal parent, not by anything that's pre-political, not by biology, but whether the state recognizes you.
Yeah.
So again, it's a power grab of the state. And the same thing with transgenderism. The only way the state could treat a trans woman, meaning a biologically male, a biological male, the same as a biological woman, was to say biology is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And so once again, the state has decided I will determine, biology is irrelevant. The state will determine whether you're a man or a woman. So in every case, it was a huge power grab by the state. In each case, it was a dismissal of biology, and in the process, giving far more power to the state. It's, like with parenthood, you are essentially your child's parent now by permission of the state. It has these logical implications, take some time to work themselves out, but that's the logic. And
I know.
A society does eventually tend to work out the logic of its commitments, its philosophical commitments.
It's a scary time, and I hope Christ returns pretty soon. That would be fun. But guys, again, the book is Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. Please get it and read it. It's a wonderful read. And Professor Nancy Pearcey, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed your book and enjoyed your videos. So it's great to finally meet you.
Great to meet you too. Thank you guys. We'll see you next week.